Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for the Reading Across Campus program. My name is Kristen Risley. I'm a professor of English and a member of the Literature Committee in the Department of English, Philosophy, and Communication Studies. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the library and to our latest event for Reading Across Campus. This year's featured text is The Rising of the Moon, a one-act play by Ireland's Lady Gregory, which was first produced by the Irish National Theatre, called Abbey Theatre in Dublin, Ireland on March 9th, 1907. Before we get underway, I would like to share a few important acknowledgements. Today's presentation is made possible by a grant from our Provost's office and is co-sponsored by the UW Stout Honors College. I would like to thank my colleagues on the Literature Committee for their commitment and hard work in making this type of cultural programming available to our campus community. Special thanks to our committee chair, Dr. Lopa Bazou, and committee member, Dr. Joan Navarre, whose love for and expertise in British literature and culture played a major role in bringing the work of Lady Gregory to UW Stout. Thank you to our colleagues in the library, especially Corey Whipke, for hosting us in this lovely space and for supporting Reading Across Campus. And finally, thanks to all of you for being here today. Two other events preceded today's speaker as part of our Reading Across Campus. Last autumn, we hosted a concert reading performance of the play in the Harvey Hall Theatre, accompanied by a pop-up exhibit on the author, Lady Gregory. In February, we followed that with another theater performance, including dancers from Chippewa Valley Irish Dance, as well as a presentation by scholar Patrick O'Donnell, who discussed the play in terms of the Dublin theater scene and the Irish literary renaissance of the late 19th and early 20th century. Today, we'll consider the Irish nationalism that inspired the Irish literary renaissance and shaped the play. Additionally, since The Rising of the Moon is a political text dealing with the relationship between England and Ireland, it's important to understand the social history of the period. We are therefore delighted to have Dr. Sean Farrell with us here today for his presentation titled A Scholar's Funeral and the Transnational Politics of Irish Nationalism. Sean Farrell is a professor of history at Northern Illinois University, where he teaches courses in British history, Irish history, and world history. A former president of the American Conference for Irish Studies, he has published a wide range of articles and books on religion and politics in 19th century Ireland, including the award-winning Rituals and Riots, Sectarian Violence and Political Culture in Ulster, 1784 to 1886, and The Irish in Illinois, co-authored with Matthew Billings. His latest book is Thomas Drew and the Making of Victorian Belfast. A lesser-known accomplishment of Dr. Farrell is that he has been my esteemed colleague and dear friend for over 30 years. I am so grateful that he could take time out of his busy schedule, drive up to Menominee on a holiday weekend, and visit our campus today in order to share just a bit of his vast knowledge of Irish studies. Please help me extend a warm Blue Devils welcome to my friend and colleague, Dr. Sean Farrell.
Thanks for being here. This is, I didn't know the Blue Devils thing. Not a real big fan, so we're just going to roll with that and be okay. But can everybody hear me fine? I'm going to speak back from the lectern. It should be, I haven't timed it out, but it should be 43 to 44 minutes, unless I get diverted by some of the image, which I will do, but that'll push it to 47, 48. So you, good afternoon. It's really wonderful to be here in Menominee, to be part of the University of Wisconsin Stout's Reading Across Campus program, a welcome celebration of both the humanities in general and of the Irish author Lady Augusta Gregory's play, Rising of the Moon in particular. I'd like to thank the Department of English, Philosophy, and Communication Studies, the Provost, and the Honors College for the invitation. More particularly, I'd like to thank my friend, Dr. Kristen Risley, who I met roughly 30 years ago in the periodicals room at Memorial Library while we were both working there at the University of Wisconsin. Time flies, certainly does. Thanks for coming in on an Easter Monday, which for reasons I'll connect later certainly has a connection and appropriate nature to the material. I've designed this talk to complement other events in the Reading Across Campus series. My friend, Dr. Patrick O'Donnell, talked about Lady Gregory's career and play in the context of the Irish National or Abbey Theatre and the Dublin scene of the era, as Kristen just said. So given that, I thought I might take a wider view of Irish cultural and national politics in the era, to use the dramatic story of an Irish language scholar's funeral or funerals. And if I can get away with this, I had thought of subtitling this talk "Four Funerals and No Wedding," but that might not play on those people who are under 40 in this room. So I thought we'd look at the global dynamics of Irish cultural politics in this era. The broader questions are seemingly both simple and difficult. What mobilizes people to act in a particular moment? How and why do people feel connected to a place that is distant from their material lives? How do local contexts shape the evolution and the meaning of global events? The story I'm talking about this afternoon concerns what we might call the death politics surrounding the funerals of Father Eugene O'Growney, the celebrated Irish language scholar who died in Los Angeles, California in 1899, a long way from Dublin. Some Irish American leaders, to summarize the story here, then decided to repatriate O'Growney's remains in Ireland, and the body was moved to San Francisco, Chicago, and New York City before it was reburied in Maynooth, Ireland in 1903. As we will see, however, this is not a simple story, and I hope you enjoy it and come to see the varieties of reasons that people came together to celebrate an Irish nationalist icon. Now, much of this talk is based on the research of other people, both by my friend, Professor Tim McMahon at Marquette University, we were just talking about, and my own PhD student at NIU, Hollis Harris, who's finishing his dissertation, hopefully working on it at the moment, on Irish American nationalist politics in the era. And I post this slide because there are rich digitized sources that are available now. And one of the kind of wonderful things about doing historical research in this era is just how much is now available through online searching. It just revolutionizes what we can do. So in the last couple of weeks, as I prepared for this, I read Agnes O'Farrell's 1904 memorial volume to O'Growney, and some Irish and Irish American newspaper accounts. But I want to be clear from the beginning, this lecture is one of synthesis rather than one that's based on my own research primarily. As Kristen, Dr. Risley's opening kind of introduced, my main area is what might be 19th century, what is now Northern Ireland. So I've been to Belfast probably every year for those 30 years we're talking about. But I did the Irish and Illinois book, and now kind of Irish American stuff really interests me. And judging by I don't want to judge too harshly here, but I think there's some Irish ancestry in this room. So let's start with a short biography of our soon-to-be dead, oops, that'll be relevant, so our soon-to-be departed or dead subject. Eugene O'Growney was born in 1863 to a middle-class family living in Athboy, a small town in County Meath, which is right north of Dublin. So Dublin is this county, this is Dublin right here. So Meath is right up in here. Athboy would be just north of there in Leinster. Now, the Ireland of O'Growney's youth was a rapidly changing society, one where the Great Famine from 1845 to 52 and mass emigration led to steep population decline. You see that echoed, and this is why I always take too long because I start doing it. You see the population decline altered in the colors of the map here, affecting the colors. And you'll see there are only three areas in Ireland where population went up between 1845 and 1852. That's reflecting the census data of 1841 to 51. And that's this is Belfast, North Point is now Northern Ireland, Dublin. This is Cove or Cork Harbor. And those urban centers, people flooded into the cities, pushing the population up. So in the famine, 1 million people died and 2 million emigrated. It's pretty standard notion over the decade. So what you have then in post-famine Ireland, in the Ireland after the famine, was, as I always tell my students in courses, an emigration society, one where Irish social stability depended on the men, women, and children who left, both in terms of reduced pressure on existing resources and the money they sent back to United States, Canada, and Australia. If you want to connect it to today's world, think about societies around the world. We're living in an era of unmatched mobility right now. Think about the societies that would fit that moniker of emigration societies, ones that for their own social stability are dependent upon children leaving, which is a fundamentally reflection of a sick society, one would think, but it's necessary for so many societies around the world right now. People have to leave for the existing structure to stay the same. Now, it is true that the Irish men and women who survived and stayed behind generally had higher living standards and opportunities than their parents had enjoyed on an island that was rapidly modernizing. But even that came with the anxieties of an increasingly market-driven society and dramatic cultural change. The most germane variable, most connected variable of the culture change was a seemingly steep decline in the number of Irish language speakers on the island, a disproportionate number of whom had died in the famine or left for America and other destinations. You can see this in numbers, right? I'm on Polytechnic University, so we can talk a little bit in numbers. That makes sense, right? In 1891, the census data shows that there were, or says that there were 3.5% of the Irish population were Irish speakers predominantly. In 1821, 1831, the estimates are that that was nearly 85%. So in the famine, when you have this great population reduction, you'll see where the high percentages of deaths were, where you have population decline. Those were disproportionately Irish-speaking places in the West and South and West. So now there is a little, the numbers thing is a little messy because that census data overstates the decline of the language because it doesn't reflect the reality that most people were bilingual. So that 3%, 3.5%, I think it was, 1891, there's much more Irish speaking than that might imply because people were fluent in both languages throughout much of the 19th century. So, and interesting to think about for United States fans here is that most scholars would say between 20 to 25% of the immigrants to this country in the 19th century from Ireland were either monoglot Irish speakers, one language, didn't speak English, or bilingual. Okay, so my family came over in 1853 from Cork in the south of Ireland. I don't know if they had Irish or not. That only is something that's kept in the 1910 census data on down. But it's interesting to think about. I know when some people talk about immigrants who can't speak English in contemporary politics, I will get a little political here. It's okay. When people, and a lot of it comes from American stuff, they're insulting their own ancestors. Because a lot of those people who came from Ireland were not native English speakers. Okay. So to put it in context, the Irish had a lot in common with a lot of folks who are moving around the world. Okay, so look at language stuff. Even if we complicate that notion of kind of Irish speakers in decline, there's no doubt the general trend was true. The Irish language was in declining use as a majority language in Ireland. And it's certainly that fact motivated figures like O'Grady to try and revive usage of the language in the 1890s. He was not a native speaker. Discovered a love of language at the age of 15, learning it on his own and on summer excursions to the West before continuing his language learning while he trained to be a Catholic priest at the National University of Ireland in Maynooth. While he was ordained as a priest and briefly served in the church, he was hired to a new professorship in Irish in Maynooth in 1891. They were hiring him. And it's for his language advocacy that he became famous, at least famous in these circles. So two things are, at this point, worth noting about him. First, he was the author of the popular Simple Lessons in Irish, a basic textbook that first published in a newspaper in 1893. This eventually became a 5-volume series that was quite literally how Irish people learned to speak the language. By 1903, an estimated 320,000 copies of this book had been sold. Second, O'Grownie, with a more public-facing Douglas Hyde and Owen MacNeill, was one of the founders of the Gaelic League, an organization designed to preserve and revitalize the use of the Irish language. This is Irish Language Week. So this is a card, if you will, placard advertising Irish Language Week. And you see the kind of binary take on it, on which side are you on, which has, I won't go into the Joyce, but it certainly has echoes of, if you read the short story The Dead or the film, there's echoes in that story, certainly. I won't go too far into my literary because I'll be found out pretty quickly. Now, the Gaelic League was an organization that was founded in 1893, designed to preserve and revitalize the use of Irish. O'Grownie was particularly important in his job in convincing the Catholic Church to change its stance on the Gaelic League, to back it. And I should say that this is a related but slightly different cultural project than the Rising of the Moon's author, Lady Gregory, was engaged in. She was really, as an Anglo-Irish or an Irish Protestant aristocrat, she was looking back to honor certainly Irish cultural traditions and myths and use those, but she was writing that literature in the English language for the most part. She knew Irish, but she wrote in English, like William Butler Yeats in a certain way, who used many of those traditions and myths, but was writing it in English to preserve them rather than using the Irish language like the Gaelic League wanted. Now, although growth in the Gaelic League was slow, it expanded dramatically at the turn of the century, and in 1904, there were 600 branches with 40,000 members across the island. Like many Irish associations of the era, it had an Irish-American equivalent, the Gaelic League of America, which had local local chapters all across the United States. You'll see later a Detroit chapter of the GLA, which I thought was the next slide, which is why I just looked dorky there, moving to the left. Now, this Gaelic League of America would play an important role in the O'Grownie story. Avowedly non-political, the Gaelic League provided social activities and inspiration for a generation of young Irish nationalist men and women, many of whom would be involved in revolutionary politics and the foundation of the Irish state. Unfortunately, Eugene O'Grownie was not destined to see these heady days. Plagued with serious health problems, his overwork led to tuberculosis, amongst other things. O'Grownie left Maynooth for the United States in 1894 to recuperate his health. He would never return to Ireland alive, at least, moving to Prescott, Arizona, and then to California for the climate, where he died a few days later after a rather gruesome surgery in 1899 in Los Angeles. He was 36 years old. News of O'Grownie's death spread quickly. Lawrence Brannock, who's the bottom guy here, a close friend and a former student who had moved to the United States with O'Grownie, acted as a kind of mouthpiece, an early narrator who played a vital role in setting the parameters for legacy and story alike. Another key figure, and this is just a drawing of him, was Father Peter York, a radical priest and labor activist in San Francisco who had been a personal friend to O'Grouney and will play a key role in the ensuing story. At this point, however, there was no question of where O'Grouney would be buried. The Gaelic League lacked the money to bring his bones to Holy Ireland, and the publicity-shy priest had told family and friends that he had no desire for a public funeral. He was thus buried in Calvary Cemetery in Los Angeles after a funerary mass held at the Cathedral of St. Vibiana in Los Angeles. Irish Americans dominated the roster of participants at the funeral. The Reverend Barron, a priest from Santa Monica and a fellow Maynooth man of O'Grouney's, gave the sermon, and 6 members of the Ancient Order of Hibernians, a prominent Irish American Nationalist Association, acted as pallbearers. 2 of the men at the funeral, Brannock and a local newspaper editor, wore new Gaelic League pins. While there were no direct reports of the sermon, Father Barron celebrated O'Grouney's religiosity and his patriotism, key messages for a variety of Irish and Irish American constituencies. It would not be the last word for O'Grouney's final funeral. The initial impetus for returning O'Grouney's body to quote-unquote Holy Ireland lay with Lawrence Brannock, who faced a number of challenges in this project, not least the opposition of the priest and O'Grouney's own family, who made it clear, his sisters made it clear in a public letter that he had not wanted to go back to Ireland. Brannock persisted, however, and it was his November 23rd, 1899 letter to the Irish World that kicked off a protracted campaign for an Irish burial. Edited by Patrick Ford, who I'll show later, the Irish-born advocate for labor rights and agrarian reform in Ireland and the US, the Irish World was the most influential newspaper in Irish America, a position that made Ford a crucial figure on both sides of the Atlantic. To take but one example, during the Irish Land Wars, 1879 to 82, Patrick Ford raised $100,000 to support the Irish National Land League's efforts to achieve land reform. And it's quite something. I always talk to students, all the changes in Ireland that happened between, say, in post-famine Ireland, from let's say 1870 to 1916, to classic numbers. Irish Americans fund a very high percentage of the nationalist activities that are going on in Ireland, sending money and remittances back. It's kind of a change agent that we need to think about internationally. After the land reform bills were signed into law in 1881 and 1882, the British Prime Minister, William Gladstone, made clear that nothing would have happened in Ireland without Ford's fervent support. In his letter, Brannock assured Ford that O'Grouney had told him that the priest wanted to be buried in Ireland in a private conversation, outlining his selfless and patriotic devotion to Irish Ireland and intoning that it is now our sacred duty to bring him back to Ireland. Ford's publication of the letter assured that it received international attention, and fundraising began on both sides of the Atlantic, particularly after he received the blessing, finally, of the O'Grouney sisters and family in 1900. We don't have clear evidence of what Brannock, his kind of mindset and why he's doing this. Other than maybe, I mean, you'd have to take him at his word, because we don't have private papers for Brannock, and we haven't been able to get inside to what he is doing. And some of the supporters you kind of have to take with a grain of salt. His enemies, you also have to take that with a grain of salt. One of the variables we'll be talking about here today, though, is that a lot of other players in this have very clear agendas that are not exactly connected to the life and service of Eugene O'Grouney. And in many ways, it's them who I find most interesting. There was certainly precedent for an event such as taking the repatriation of Irish bones, Irish American bones in Ireland. The most resonant repatriation case was that of Terence Ballou McManus, who had participated in the rebellion of 1848, an armed rising against British rule during the midst of the famine that lasted about 10 minutes. McMahon had been convicted of treason in the aftermath of the rising, but British authorities had commuted his sentence and instead sent him and other Republicans to the penal colony of Van Diemen's Land, or Tasmania. Okay? McManus and his compatriot Thomas Francis Mahar escaped and eventually made their way back to San Francisco. While Mahar was something of an American success story, he became a general in the US Army and a territorial governor in Montana before drowning in the Missouri River. Don't recommend that. McManus's sojourn in America was a nightmare of sorts instead. And he died in poverty in 1861 at the age of 50. In death, however, McManus achieved a success that had eluded him in life. Sensing an opportunity for publicity, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, an Irish and Irish American revolutionary body now dedicated to ending British rule in Ireland through armed rebellion, raised funds to bury him in Ireland. Several months later, they disinterred the body, moving him from San Francisco to New York, where he received a lying in state at St. Patrick's Cathedral. The casket was then shipped to Ireland, where between 20 and 30,000 Irish men and women participated in a procession and funeral in Ireland before he was buried at Glasnevin Cemetery, what becomes the nationalist burial ground. In Ireland and Irish America, the politics of death were complex and resonant in nationalist memory. As Agnes O'Farrell wrote in that memorial to O'Grownie, it was a day of pride for Ireland when McManus was buried in Glasnevin. This is the vision from which the O'Grownie project was built, in other words. Well, it's clear that Brannock and Ford were interested in repatriating O'Grownie's remains in Ireland. It took some time for the campaign to develop. The O'Grownie Funeral Fund was initiated at the Gaelic League of America's annual meeting in Chicago in 1901. And Geraldine Haverty, editor of the Gale, the organization's magazine, used its pages to market the fund, listing an honor rolls of donors in each edition. And these are the types of sources which help you track, how things are put together by going through journals like this. Haverty listed the fund's goal, which was $1,500. Now, in 1900, in contemporary terms, that's roughly $42,500, just to give you a sense. This would be used to repatriate his bones. Ford used the Irish world to promote the cause, honoring O'Grownie as a patriot priest whose life had been dedicated to renationalizing the nation, to make Ireland truly Irish again. Obviously, a lot of stuff going on. Despite their efforts, the funerary fund only reached its initial goal a couple of years later in September 1902. By that time, much had changed, both in Ireland and Irish America. In 1900, John Redmond managed to unify the Irish Parliamentary Party, the largest nationalist party in Ireland, which had been split for a decade in the aftermath of Parnell's fall in 1891. A savvy political operator, Redmond quickly moved to consolidate his power, demanding that constitutional nationalists everywhere cut ties with those who advocated the use of political violence. I'm a little confused right now because I'm teaching my Modern Ireland class this semester, and we're like at right the same spot in the class. So I know I have PowerPoints for teaching that are different than the ones that I put together for this. So if I'm even a little more dancing back and forth, there's the reason. Now, this demand, Redmond's effort to kind of cut political violence off from the IPP, created all sorts of fractures in Irish America, where Clan na Gael, a relatively small but influential organization we'll talk about soon, took more aggressive action against other Irish American nationalist associations, infiltrating the leadership of the Ancient Order of Hibernians and attacking land-oriented United Irish Leagues. Now, don't worry about the particulars here, okay? They're not that important. The point is, from 1902, you're starting to get fractures appearing in an Irish American politics that had been pretty tranquil, had been pretty united in a consensus behind the O'Grownie project, and it starts playing itself out, as we'll see, in kind of battles and attacks. This new, more competitive environment was evident at the Gaelic League of America's convention at the Academy of Music in Philadelphia in 1902. It was clear that a fight was brewing. As Haverty put it in the Gale, there were two parties, and each side seemed to suspect and distrust the other, and apparently expected that undue advantage would be taken if the opportunity offered. Well, it's hard to reconstruct an exact characterization of the two factions. It's clear that O'Grouney's friend, Father York, remember him from San Francisco, headed up a more radical group advocating a more confrontational, action-oriented Irish American politics, and that they were opposed by a more moderate, established-oriented party more concerned with perceptions of Irish America's legitimacy and respectability. A body led by the GLA Vice President, Major E.T. McChrystal from New York. When McChrystal tried to use a parliamentary tactic to exclude York's California delegation, the meeting descended into chaos, with several delegates physically charging at the vice president only to be forcibly detained while others gathered around shouting or gesticulating. Philadelphia policemen had to be brought into a meeting of the Gaelic League of America, I might remind you. And the owner of the hall stationed 2 policemen with nightsticks outside the door, ready for business, as he put it. This did nothing to quell chaos, and it was decided that the convention should close down for a day. Now, what exactly were the issues that divided the delegates in Philadelphia? The most controversial involved a long-standing issue involving Richard Henebry, a professor of Irish whose appointment had not been renewed at the Catholic University of America. Henebry was by all accounts a curmudgeonly, difficult character who had done much to offend his colleagues at Catholic, but he refused to go quietly, and York and his followers backed the academic, saying his non-renewal was an insult to Irish Ireland. He was a fiddle player in his roots. For our purposes here today, the much more important issue, however, was the two groups' struggle over the O'Grouney funeral arrangement and just who would accompany Eugene O'Grouney's body when it was reburied in Ireland. Clearly, the O'Grouney funeral had become a touchstone event that various Irish American stakeholders wanted to be part of and associated with. McChrystal publicly accused York and his allies of attempting to control the funeral. He was right, since this was exactly what York then proceeded to do. It's hard not to see the shadowy hand of Clan na Gael in Philadelphia. I should make clear that there is no direct evidence of it happening. That's a picture, by the way, of Patrick Ford, who's the editor of the Irish World and a labor advocate in the United States. And this is a page from Gerald Haverty's The Gael, the Gaelic League of America's book. I couldn't find a photograph of Haverty which says something about gender in Irish American politics and the power of patriarchy to control imagery. But this is a lovely kind of image of the type of stylized art you see at the period. Maybe I was drinking this morning while I was doing it. We're all in the wrong order. Here we go. It's hard not to see the shadowy hand of Clan na Gael in Philadelphia. And I should say that, again, there's no direct evidence of this. But as I tell students in my research classes, the historical record rarely provides researchers with smoking guns. Our job as historians is to put together a persuasive argument from available historical evidence. And then people can correct with their arguments, and we go back and forth as it moves forward. Before we talk about those pieces, however, we need to take a brief detour to understand just who we're talking about. Clan na Gael was founded in New York City in 1867, an Irish-American Republican society dedicated to using any and all means to end British rule in Ireland. The organization was behind high-profile events like the Catalpa Rescue of 1876, a rescue effort of Irish Republican prisoners held in a penal colony in Australia, and a dynamiting campaign in Britain in the 1880s, a controversial initiative that certainly backfired for the organization. Clan na Gael fell apart in the 1890s, but was reunited in 1900 under the leadership of this man, John Devoy, Daniel Cahalan, and Joseph McGarity. The latter here, McGarity, will come back in our story because he's based in Philadelphia, which helps to kind of shape my somewhat speculative argument here. Now, soon thereafter, the organization began to infiltrate other organizations And there are a number of things that suggest that this is what happened in the Gaelic League of America meeting. York, for example, was rumored to be a member and was at the very least sympathetic and will do deals with these guys as we move forward. It's also worth noting that Devoy and Cuchulainn rushed the Clan na Gael's new newspaper because every single Irish American news organization has to have its own newspaper. It's just a rule. Paul Meany has to be in every Irish movie ever made, and they all have to have a newspaper, even if they're a supposedly secret society. Okay? So with or without, so they rushed this newspaper into print so that it can cover the O'Grownie funeral, which again underlines how this thing is beginning cultural capital. With or without Clan na Gael's involvement, York and his allies outmaneuvered their more respectable foes when the meeting reconvened. McChrystal found that York had installed one of the men who had assaulted him in the Gaelic League of America meeting the day before as the new president. And the defeated clique now found themselves marginalized. While a deal that was brokered kept the Gaelic League from breaking into two, mediation most likely done by this man or his representatives at the meeting, it was York's more radical and confrontational wing that was now in control. York, Professor Hanebry, and Major O'Donovan, the new GLA president, i.e. the man who had assaulted the previous one, were named three of the four pallbearers for the O'Grownie funeral. So there are three of the four guys who travel across the Atlantic and go to Ireland when that happens. With Lawrence Brannock, it was them who had managed the O'Grownie funeral in the US. And it was no accident that they would be increasingly joined by Clan na Gael and trappings. So at the scholar's funeral was quickly becoming a vehicle for revolutionary politics. So before we shift the scene to Los Angeles and we do our American tour, it might be time to take a step back and think about the larger project. The idea of exhuming or disinterring a body and reburying it in another place as an expression of nationality. Now we can think of that project, and it happens in Ireland. You know, I mentioned Terence Ballou McManus. We can talk about Sir Roger Casement, an Anglo-Irish humanitarian and revolutionary executed in 1916, whose desire to have his remains buried on family land in what is now Northern Ireland was long denied by the British government. The Irish government finally gets them to agree in repatriating in 1965, but the British don't allow him to be buried in Northern Ireland. They're worried it'll explode politically. And he's instead buried in Dublin. But the desire to be buried in the right place is not just an Irish thing. If you do a Google search for this, you can see all sorts of issues, a lot of scholarship on, for example, the products of civil war in Uganda and in parts of Africa where people are buried in the wrong ground, you know, and then when the politics of that shift, the bodies are then repatriated to the right ground. More classically, of course, you know, the first thing you come up with Google on repatriation is like American soldiers and, you know, repatriating ground, people who died. There's a real power to bringing the bodies back to America. So you could think Vietnam, just as a classic thing for old guys like me. Also, we can think about, you know, a different-ish issue, but it's kind of along the same lines. The contemporary Midwest is not free of these dynamics, of course, as hundreds of Indian nations attempt to repatriate human remains from a wide variety of institutions located in the upper Midwest, one of which is my wife's anthropology museum. While the dynamics here are different, O'Grownie did choose to move to the United States. So I'm not saying it's an exact parallel. What I am saying is there's a seemingly ubiquitous global dynamic. We can pick lots of episodes where getting the body in the right place is important to memory, to nationalism, to people, a community of people, not just an Irish thing, I guess what I'm saying. In September of 1903, Father Eugene O'Grownie's remains were removed from his initial grave at Cavalry Cemetery in Los Angeles. San Francisco. We'll get there in a second. Lawrence Brannock attended the disinterment, and his detailed description of the opening of the grave is both evocative of the scene and a little creepy. Upon opening the grave, we found the wooden coffin, dry, but the nails were rusty, so it was easy to take apart. We found him in the same calm repose as when he saw him last, with his hands folded across his breast, between his figures the beads and crucifix which had been placed there by Sister Angela. The body was in a fair state of preservation, and the full beard still covered the face, while the purple vestments in which we robed him were but slightly discolored. After the coffin was removed, the body was placed in a new casket with documents in Irish, English, and Latin to identify the body. The remains were then to move to the St. Fabiana's Cathedral in LA, where the Catholic hierarchy and local Irish American elites held a long ceremony honoring O'Growney with representatives of the Ancient Order of Hibernians, the Gaelic League of America, and the Knights of Columbus, a Catholic, real Catholic institution there, acting as pallbearers, both real and honorary. In doing so, they also celebrated themselves, as the report in San Francisco's Irish Leader made clear. In restoring to the mother country the bones of Eugene O'Growney, the Irish of California are performing their piety and their patriotism. These relics are too precious to be on a foreign shore. It is meet and just that the Gaels of California should deem it a high privilege to give back to the motherland. After lying in state in the cathedral for another 2 days, the casket was moved to make the 1,000-mile journey north to San Francisco, with only Lawrence Brannock as its companion on the train. When O'Growney's remains arrived at the station in San Francisco, they were met by Father Peter York, the Gaelic League executive and radical labor priest. You may not know that San Francisco had a sizable and diverse Irish population in this period. In 1896, 1/3 of the city's population was Irish, largely working class communities who peopled a wide array of Irish associations. York's forceful and abrasive manner matched well with Irish San Francisco, or at least laboring parishioners at St. Peter's Parish Church, from which he battled anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant, and anti-labor sentiments of the American Protective Association, a nativist organization, period. O'Growney's casket was then moved to the Hall of the Red Branch Knights, an Irish Catholic fraternal organization, then led by Sheriff Tom Desmond, a veteran of the 1876 Fenian Catalpa rescue. So we're seeing more and more kind of things involving people who are involved in the physical force side of Irish nationalism here. There's no smoking gun, but there's a heck of a lot of circumstantial evidence that's coming together. Draped with an American flag, the coffin was guarded by armed members, here we go, of the Irish Volunteers, another suggestive link to Clan na Gael and the physical force tradition of Irish republicanism. In her memorial volume, Agnes O'Farrell emphasized the diverse array of people who visited the hall that week, ranging from members of the Catholic hierarchy and the city's Irish establishment to, to men still in their work clothes after working on the docks, which is where my dad's family, the Farrell family, unionized the docks in San Francisco in the 20s and 30s, which is why on my father's side, if you ever voted for a Republican, they were associated in that part of California in that period of time with union busting. So they were the ones who sent the thugs to beat up my granddad when they were trying to unionize the docks, which is a very violent process, of unionizing the docks in the 20s and 30s. So the body then, so you have this wide array of people, the whole community, if you will. The body was moved from the hall later that week with Brannock and local members of the various Irish societies marching in procession through the crowded streets to St. Mary's Cathedral, where a service was held. The service was led by members of the California delegation of the GLA, with Father York giving the eulogy. In a very long address, he sketched a long narrative of Ireland's history before saying that O'Growney epitomized the union of patriot and priest, faith and fatherland, and that his life's work had been dedicated to the idea that Ireland could not be truly free if its language was allowed to die. It's worth noting here that O'Growney's life dedicated to the Irish language could be celebrated by a wide variety of Irish Americans, most of whom had little connection to the Irish language. If the question of who controlled and got credit for the funeral could be divisive in Irish American politics, however, it's also important to appreciate the way that O'Grownie and the Irish language here could be a symbol of consensus for Irish Americans from different walks of life, from different experiences. Certainly, the San Francisco Irish felt that way. As O'Farrell wrote in her memorial, it was a red letter day for the Irish in San Francisco. Brannick again was the sole mourner who accompanied O'Grownie's casket on the train to Chicago. They received a like reception in the Windy City, where an Irish American delegation brought the casket to Holy Name Cathedral, where the president of Notre Dame and other Irish Catholic elites from Chicago and the surrounding area feted O'Grownie in similar terms. O'Grownie, a local Chicago paper, had died for Ireland, and his efforts to make Ireland truly Irish had saved the Emerald Isle and her exiled children. While various reports seem to indicate that community enthusiasm was a little less marked in Chicago than it had been on the Pacific, ceremonies and Irish American organizations involved in the public rituals of the visit largely echoed their predecessor. There's Holy Name. There seems little need to replicate that, so I'll just move on. Father O'Grownie's funeral procession finally reached New York City on September 17th of 1903. Preparation for the visit had been made by the Clonegales Brain Trust and their allies in the GLA, a product of the fallout from York's victory in Philadelphia. When O'Grownie's remains arrived at Grand Central Station, they were met by a delegation that included his brother Christopher, Major Donovan, the president of the Gaelic League of America, who had assaulted McChrystal, if you remember, in Philadelphia, and Daniel Cullen, the vice president of Clonegale. And here you see then the first public evidence of Clonegale's involvement in the funeral. So you see Daniel Cullen here is a member of the Clonegale, and you see John DeVoy, who is the president. In New York, they take a public and open forum. There's kind of a avowed and clear use there. This was the first public appearance for the Klan, a clear reflection of their role in the preparations. But there's also a clear effort to present a united front. Moderates like E.T. McChrystal and Stephen Richardson, publisher of the Gale, were also at the station to meet the body. The delegation inevitably brought the remains to St. Patrick's Cathedral, accompanied by another honors guard from the Irish Volunteers and a crowd of a few hundred observers. Father Michael Lavelle gave his eulogy in Irish before concluding with a brief account of O'Grownie's significance in English, concluding with a moving tribute to the priest's love of the Irish language. All the while, the casket waited under guard by details from the AOH and the volunteers. After the Mass was concluded, thousands of New Yorkers reportedly walked by the casket to honor the man who had dedicated his life to an Irish Ireland. From there, the plan was to have a grand funeral procession carry Father O'Grownie's remains to New York City's docks, allowing thousands of Irish Americans to see him off before his transatlantic journey to his final resting place. Unfortunately, problems occurred. According to John DeVoy in the Gaelic American, the GLA had arranged for the Cunard Steamship Company to carry Father O'Grownie's remains to Ireland on the Campania. Image here. Ship. But at the last second, company officials informed the funeral organizers that the ship would refuse the casket if a funeral procession accompanied it to the docks. The decision apparently stemmed from company fears that passengers would refuse to embark knowing that a corpse was on board. According to DeVoy, the planned procession would have been quite spectacular, the largest Irish event in the history of New York City. Clonegale had marshaled 800 volunteers, hundreds of AOH members, and over 80 other organizations for the proposed parade. As news of the Cunard difficulty spread, Irish American unity disappeared, as rivals battled over the politics of commemoration and nationality. The Gale alleged that a competing steamship company had offered to carry his remains and allow the procession, but that Clonegale's leaders had squandered the chance by not replying to the offer in time. We all know people don't answer email. DeVoy's Gaelic American contended that the Gaelic League had entered into an agreement from which they could not honorably withdraw, and wiser counsels prevailed. The Gael publicly disagreed, stating for obvious reason the press of New York had not kept particularly and wisely informed about the funeral arrangements. There certainly was confusion here. Apparently, a few hundred people even waited outside St. Patrick's for the procession on the planned day, only to be told that the remains had already been moved from the cathedral hours earlier. Regardless of the truthiness of these conflicting reports, the grand procession through New York was canceled, and Father O'Grany's remains were taken to the docks by a small escort only and loaded on the Campania to head for Ireland. Given the massive effort dedicated to repatriating O'Grany's remains and all the political maneuvering relative to his funeral in Philadelphia, New York, San Francisco, etc., it seems ironic that Father O'Grany received a semblance of his final wishes when the mass funeral procession was canceled. After all, his sisters had argued that their brother would like to be left in peace and forgotten. He never asked to be a martyr to the Irish nation, and certainly would have been very uncomfortable with the faith and fatherland narrative that so many of his eulogists delivered. The shy priest seemingly preferred his lonely grave along the faraway Pacific and the relative obscurity it allowed him in death. If that was true, relative calm and silence would return to O'Grany's afterlife in America, where he remained a critical figure for Irish language enthusiasts and Catholic priests, but his name quickly faded from most Irish American memories. Activists like Devoy and McGarity may have remained focused on Irish events, but most Irish Americans returned to their everyday lives, lives informed by the celebration of Irish connections, to be sure, but lives dominated by fundamentally local and American concerns. If O'Grany was soon forgotten in most Irish American circles, however, the story was not yet done. A little more than a week after leaving New York City, the steamship arrived in Cove, a port south of Cork City. Getting off the Campania, Lawrence Brannock and other pallbearers were greeted by members of the Gaelic League, the Catholic Church, and a variety of Irish nationalist culture associations. Get there soon. This initiated a week-long celebration of O'Grany's life and legacy in Ireland that echoed its Irish American predecessors. The highlight came on the morning of September 26th, when O'Grany's bones were paraded through downtown Dublin to the Catholic Pro Cathedral. The procession that followed mustered over 6,000 people and extended for 1.25 miles through the city streets. As my friend Tim McMahon's analysis of participants makes clear, the procession underlines the broad appeal of the Gaelic League. The Gaelic League members were certainly there in force, alongside Catholic associations, trade unions, and members of Republican secret societies that were being watched by the Dublin Metropolitan Police. Among the Gaelic League leaders involved in these celebrations, I might add, interestingly, was Patrick Pearse, who, with another of other revolutionaries, would lead the Easter Rising of 1916, itself largely funded by Clan na Gael and other Irish American groups we've been talking about. But that was for the future. O'Grany's bones never reached Glasnevin or any of the other hallowed Irish nationalist cemeteries that the Gaelic League in America or Clan na Gael had marketed as worthy of his patriotism. Instead, on September 27, 1903, the funeral cortege instead left Dublin for Maynooth, and from the station there, where O'Grany was buried in a cemetery attached to Maynooth University, his alma mater and the place where he built a career with his lifelong love of the Irish language. But even that was not permanent. His permanent resting place, as the body was again disinterred in February of 1905 and reburied in a private ceremony at a special mausoleum in Maynooth designed to celebrate the quiet champion of Irish Ireland. This time, he was there to stay. So what do we learn about by looking at the many funerals of Eugene O'Grany? What do we see by examining the politics of death as we follow this shiny casket full of bones from Los Angeles to their ultimate resting place in Maynooth, north of Dublin? And how is any of this related to the Rising of the Moon? The first thing to note is the global reach of Irish cultural nationalism at the turn of the century. Mass emigration had created a worldwide Irish community, men and women who were both connected to and played key roles in cultural movements like the Gaelic Revival or the Celtic Renaissance. If relatively few members of the diaspora were Irish speaker, and there are more than you might think, as I hinted at earlier, by 1900, if you talk about 20 to 25%, which is the number I gave earlier, second generation tends not to pick up the language in those big numbers, right? So you get a fade in a second. So by 1900, we're starting to get a turn in those. And if 20 to 25% of the immigrants could speak Irish, those people were dying off, and their sons and daughters probably were not learning the language at the same numbers. But you still would have pretty sizable communities until about 1930. You've again had a rebirth in the use of the Irish language in the late 80s and 90s, so that more people are speaking it in Ireland. For example, when you guys go to Ireland, and you all should, you'll see, and this has been true for a long time, you'll see the language, all signs, all government, you won't see government documents unless you get arrested, are in both English and Irish. So the Irish language still is a kind of symbolic marker of Irish nationality. But higher percentages of people, since Ireland became a wealthier country in the 90s, have taken up the language again. So it's an interesting issue there, I think. Now, what's interesting though, if relatively few people, I think it is, were Irish speakers, there was clearly a consensus view in the diaspora that the Irish Ireland project of reviving the Irish language and celebrating traditional Irish culture was a worthy one, something worth championing in public. And I think it also becomes a bit of a battle issue against people who are anti-Catholic in particular. So the American Protective Association, those nativist groups, a lot of the sensitivity you see in the Irish community about respectability and stuff is them fighting against images, disparaging images they think others are imposing on them. It is interesting, of course, right, that the O'Grownie funeral project was driven by people in the diaspora, not by people at home in Ireland. Initiated in Los Angeles and funded by Irish Americans predominantly in California, but also in Chicago and New York City. Eulogies delivered across the country celebrated O'Grownie as this patriot priest, as somebody who had given his life through his dedication to renationalizing the island through his work on the Irish language. This was, in some ways, a different kind of good death, if you will. Someone not killed fighting for his nation on the battlefield, but one who died after a surgery done to mend a body broken through hard work for Irish Ireland. If Irish Americans could agree that O'Grownie was to be celebrated, their reasons for doing so varied considerably. Many were driven by an enthusiasm for the Irish language, as seen by the proliferation of various language societies or the controversy surrounding the non-renewal of Professor Richard Hennebrey at Catholic University of America. Now, some of that latter controversy was also driven by our second variable, and that is an overwhelming need to be seen to defending the legitimacy and respectability of intertwined notions of Irish Catholicism and Irish nationalism. This strand can be seen in all the public rituals connected to the O'Grownie funeral. The celebration of the Catholic and Irish elites who participated in the funerals, that O'Grownie memorial guide, which is available online in case you're looking for evening reading tonight, has a picture of every Irish American bishop, seemingly every other page. There's so name-dropping bishops, image-dropping with respectability, and these images of we've made it, we're in power, we have authority. Look, there's that dynamic all over this. And that's also reflected, I think, in the public rituals in these grand cathedrals at the hearts of cities, at St. Bibiana in Los Angeles, at St. Patrick's in New York, at Holy Name in Chicago. These huge public structures opened up to have people see these events happening. I think also reflect a kind of, we're here, we're right, we're legitimate, we're respectable, we're all right. Finally, if there was an Irish American consensus about the need to honor O'Grownie and his service to the nation, it was equally clear that the funeral generated and reflected political division in Irish America. as different associations battled over who would control the public ceremonies attached to the funeral. My doctoral student, Hollis Harris, is arguing in his dissertation that these years saw the emergence of a new kind of Irish American politics, one dedicated to a more active, confrontational, and action-oriented visions politics. And we can see that here in the O'Grady funeral, where figures like Father York, John Devoy, Joe McGarity were able to, in some ways, win the politics of death, if you will. They got to take the boat trip and to be seen to be doing so. And it is nationalist politics, of course, here it is, that links this story to Lady Gregory's 1907 play, The Rising of the Moon, a simple political text about the necessity and appeal of Irish nationality and independence, itself built around Lady Gregory's use of a famous Republican ballad of the 1798 Rising, Tell Me, Sean O'Farrell, The Rising of the Moon. The patriotism of the Irish dead looms large over the era, in other words. Whether in a ballad shadowy memories of Republican heroes or a sickly priest who died trying to revive the Irish language he loved. On another Easter Monday, 11 years after Eugene O'Grady was finally laid to rest in Maynooth, a group of Irish men and women took up arms in the streets of Dublin, inspired by these same dreams in many ways of Irish Ireland, trying to call it into being with the Easter Rising. The dead would again play a vital role in changing the rising from failure to something else. But that's a story for another day. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have a few moments we can take some question and answer. To pose a question.
Doesn't have to be connected to O'Grady. It could be general Irish American stuff. Is that good? What you got? I assumed you had a question.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I do have one.
Good. It's a good one. We'll see. He's got a question.
Yeah.
Then I'll come back.
Like, when it comes to like during the time of troubles and the IRA, what were the general opinions of Irish Americans?
Okay, so we need to be clear on when we're talking about, because there's been a lot of troubles. So if you're talking about Northern Ireland and the troubles from the mid-60s and 70s, Irish American opinions are tough to kind of generalize about. When conflict opens in the late 60s and early 70s, right? So when you start getting events happening, Bloody Sunday, for example, which happens in Derry, where the British paratroopers shoot and kill 13 unarmed demonstrators. Events like that exploded. So some of the more atrocity-oriented events that come out of the conflict explode. Mayor Daley in Chicago becomes an enemy of the Irish government and the British government very quickly when he shouts some things that we don't need to repeat, and the Hitler parallels and all sorts of stuff that get you in trouble publicly. He lost it. And there is a wide array of then on controversial events when there are explosions of violence. Irish Americans, in a broader sense, send money support, not necessarily to the IRA, but to other organizations to support Irish Catholics in Northern Ireland. I would say, so it depends on what you're talking about. So the big hits events that we look at in the early trouble period, 62 to 70, I think there is more of a sympathetic view of, we don't have the IRA yet, but of really, or they're not a prominent player really until post 70, I would say, in different ways, late 69, 70. Irish Americans are more kind of sympathetic. That changes with the bombings. When the IRA starts engaging in bombing campaigns later on, that turns more centrist Irish American public opinion into a more ambivalent and negative space. It's not as wide a consensus, in other words. Once the conflict becomes viewed as a long-running guerrilla war between a British state and a paramilitary organization. You get all sorts of complexity there. When it shifts from kind of the British troops going in and atrocity narratives to a more long war, I think moderate Irish American opinion shifts into a more ambivalent space there. It comes back in the hunger strikes then in 1981, 82. I just slow down because I could probably talk about this for 3 hours. But when there are these moments of atrocity, of British policy mistake, and the hunger strikes are certainly that. A deal had been brokered to get the guys off to come up with a solution to the problem. They would have probably gone off the hunger strikes, but Thatcher, Prime Minister Thatcher, wouldn't do it, and it backfired on her, to put it kindly. But in those moments, then again, you have the kind of creation of a more consensus agreement again. And then things move forward. But in those, like the bombing campaigns in the 70s that the IRA engages with, really does tremendous publicity damage to them and kind of moderate the broad consensus of Irish America. But it shifts back and forth with the tide of events. In the early 80s, last comment, and I'll go to the other question if they're still here, is in the early 80s, Irish American politicians on the East Coast mostly, Moynihan and others, and Tip O'Neill, locked down and really reduced the amount of funding that's coming from Irish America to the IRA as an explicit project to try and funnel things in more constitutional politics direction. That get at some of what you're talking about. Happy to. Yeah, no, it's great. Thanks. We have another question back here. Eric Beards.
Sort of comments. Has that changed very much over the course? And is it related to, as you had already said, swaying public opinion?
I think the packet stuff, the money, yeah, it changed dramatically. So in the mid-90s, and it changed as Ireland became a different kind of country. So you had in the late 19th century, early 20th century, money sent from Irish American immigrants back to Irish people is an incredibly important part of sustaining families' life. And they kind of expected, and there are some development of resentment, right, amongst Irish Americans, like, oh, you want more money. Still asking for money. But that was a key part of an Ireland that was poor and rural in lots of parts of its society. As immigrant numbers go down, and they do so from the 1920s onward, that dynamic changes. And Ireland in the 50s, which starts changing and modernizing and becoming probably broadly more prosperous, you don't have any, today, you can make, I think on most world scales, Ireland's a richer country than the United States on its per capita stats. There's all sorts of weirdness in how that's measured. So, but there's no, I do remember I was in a meeting with Martin McGuinness, the then Northern Irish education minister, actually, who's former IRA chief of staff and all sorts of stuff. And some Irish Americans started going, well, are we still spending money? Our companies are still employing you. And McGuinness said, yeah, no. And there's a whole bunch of really big Irish companies in Chicago that support you. And we're glad to have our Irish companies employing Americans. And he said it with that dry Ulster wit. I'm just like, ooh, man. So there is a equilibrium there. But in the 19th century, which was the kind of time period I was talking about, from the famine to, let's say, to the 20s, to World War I, which shuts down immigration and others across the Atlantic. That period, that's when those packets, those letters, you'd look for money because, especially in the west of Ireland, you had a lot of rural poverty amongst the laboring population there. And that is not so much connected to politics, in other words, is what I'm trying to get at, as it was connected to economics and the shifting nature of the society. But the transatlantic thing is you can't do Irish history and not look at America or Australia and see that's where the global Irish thing is so valuable. And that's when we study a play like this, like Lady Gregory's play. that you have to be able to, okay, it's all about the English and the Irish, and it's actually a lot more complicated than that. I read it for the first time this afternoon. Created that, with the drive. And it's like takes 10 minutes. It's short. And it's a conversation between, like, you know, a policeman or soldier and a ragged guy, right? It's really interesting, but it also has to be looked at in this broader frame, because certainly all Irish people were connected to somebody outside the island at that point. It's just a part of life. Please, yeah.
It's a two-sided question.
Gosh, two-sided question. Yes.
Thank you so much for
Ah.
being here. Funny thing about this individual, so. I'm gonna, the two sides that I'm gonna talk about, that's going to talk about money
Hmm.
and then about art. Let's
Oh.
end with art.
The first one will be easier for me
It
than the
seems-
second, I guess.
That is big business.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, did they monetize his death insofar as did they take his hair and have like mourning jewelry?
No.
Did they market? Did they do any kind of marketing that way?
No, there's no kind of relic economy the way you certainly see with saints and places across the world. There's no evidence of that, at least in the stuff I've seen.
Seems like, well, Victoria made mourning big business, didn't she? And then her big elder.
Well, death, of course, in the 19th century was big business, whether Victoria made it or not. I mean, in
Yeah.
Victorian culture, all sorts of, I mean, just
And some
really,
of it's
really weird stuff.
creepy,
I'll just
like
put it that way.
telling women at what stage they should go to a mourning store and buy
Mhm.
their next black dress.
Well, there's all sorts of schedules and times, yeah, and it's all worked out. I find reading that description, Brannick's description of the body there and them opening the grave, and like, oh, look, the beard's still there.
So,
And I didn't grow up in. Anyways, you had an art question. Yeah.
curious if this in scholarship, did you run across? I kept thinking about Walt Whitman, when Lilacs Left in the Dooryard Gloom, writing about Lincoln's body traveling through the country. Did any artists get inspired by this and write a great?
Not that I am, but I now have a new question to ask my dissertating student who's working on. It is interesting if you look at the mobility of the event, and I'll steer it gently away from art by talking about, the train procession. That part is really interesting to me, and that kind of the mobility of events like that, where you can use technology, where you can use trains and railway to stage public events like this, so they can take the remains in this shiny new casket. They can scoot it up the coast 1,000 miles. It's a lot longer from Sycamore to Menominee, right? And scoot it up the coast of San Francisco, where you have this Irish community that's very vibrant. His friend, Father York, is there. It can mobilize the numbers. Then you can shift it across to Chicago. And Hollis and I have been looking for places in between, but it goes directly. I think there's no evidence of there. I would have thought they would have hit. My thought was they would have hit St. Louis. They were thinking St. Louis, a big Irish community there. Rail center kind of makes a lot of sense. You'd hit there and then move up. Denver's not really Denver yet in that sense, so there's no real other place. The jumps. You could do Milwaukee, but they come to Chicago, do Holy Name. But we haven't seen any evidence. So then you hit New York City, and then you've got the steamship that can move it to Ireland, quickly, keep the momentum up. This kind of technology of political and Lincoln's funeral, of course, is a parallel in British politics. Gladstone's the first one who starts a mobile politics of public, where he's campaigning and stuff like this. And so I think the mobility of public display is a really interesting element of here that allows a fairly small, discrete number of people to make larger splashes in the press, and in the Irish press mostly. But these stories are covered in the San Francisco Chronicle and the Chicago Tribune, in the New York papers that are not the Gaelic American or the Irish Leader or something like this. But they can make big splashes in spaces that you couldn't have done that before you had trains, before you had, I was going to say planes, trains, automobiles, but anyways. How deft was that moving away from the art to the technology part? That's appropriate stuff. Right? Anything else? Any other Northern Irish or Irish related stuff? Irish American.
Yes, one more thing.
Oh, please.
The IRA.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Go for it.
I guess I'm pretty interested.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting subject.
Yeah, I did mention how the IRA didn't really come into being until like the 70s, 80s.
No, so there's a distinction here I wanted to make. You were talking about the troubles of Northern Ireland. So the IRA isn't a dominant player within the troubles of Northern Ireland, I would argue, until 69, late 69, 70. There is an IRA. The IRA is created in it's a rebranding of the Irish Volunteers in 1919 in the Irish War of Independence against Britain. That IRA continues. They don't buy into the independent Ireland. They reject the settlement that leads to the Irish creation of the Irish Free State in 1922-23. The IRA continues as a small rejectionist organization that's fighting cross raids and hitting it in Belfast every once in a while. But it's a fairly small, discrete, fairly easy. There's campaigns and whatnot in the 30s and 50s over the border. The Irish Free State, during World War II, jails members of the IRA, some of which die on hunger strike, and the Dublin government goes, too bad. Not as controversial as it was later in the British. So the IRA is in existence from 1921. So the current members of like dissident IRA factions in Belfast and maybe a few boys in Derry still, probably not actually, or Belfast, would talk about the invention of the IRA in 21. But they would also say that the IRA is a continuation of an Irish rebellious tradition that goes back at least till 1798. But the IRA as an organization advocating using violence, military cells, hit and running against British to drive the British out of Ireland is born in the Irish War of Independence in 1919. And really, you would call like the 1916 Rising, they would say the members of the volunteers, they would sort of predecessors of the IRA. But the IRA word itself, the term, Aaron, Irish Republican Army, really is born in 1918, 1919. We're not really sure, but in the midst of the War of Independence. And the Southern institution, largely Southern thing, is kind of a distinct, little bit different thing than the organization that's born really in the Troubles again, reborn, if you will, in 68, 69, and the Troubles in Belfast, Northern Ireland. If you have any questions on the IRA stuff, and if you're interested in that, feel free to get my email address and stuff if you want to continue this conversation with more stuff on Northern Ireland. I'd be happy to give you resources and information and all sorts of stuff. I've had lots of graduate students and people worked on it. Yeah, please.
Simple question for you.
I don't.
Current political situation. Everyone,
Okay.
you ever see a unified Ireland without the disconnect? I think it's now Northern Ireland's a part of the British Empire or whatever.
Northern Ireland is a part of the United Kingdom. It is since 20, and obviously that's been complicated by Britain's withdrawal from the European Union, Brexit disaster, which complicated Irish politics to no end because it really messed up with the Belfast Agreement or Good Friday. Do I see a united Ireland? My first statement is that I wouldn't predict that. I mean, I wouldn't say that any answer that I give is in terms of probabilities and numbers and what I see in tendencies and trends. Rather, it could happen very much so. Because my attitudes, I think, are shifting quickly. Times changing, populations are changing, all sorts of stuff. But we can't. But that would be a lame, right? So I will say that there's a lot of rhetoric about a united Ireland just around the corner. I don't believe that. I don't believe that at all. I think people in the Irish Republic, which is the independent state of Ireland with a capital in Dublin, all the polls would say, yeah, that would be great, but we're not willing to, and you list the things they're not willing to do, pay the taxes, pay for security, pay for the 60% of the population of Northern Ireland wants nothing to do with the United Ireland still. And there is a substantial evidence that at least a core, and there's some evidence that attitudes are changing. In middle class Belfast, Protestants are becoming more amenable to that. In some numbers, the growth of the Alliance Party, I could get into the grubby details here. But the reality is there's a substantial core of largely working class, largely Belfast, but also in other parts of Northern Ireland, Protestants who want nothing to do with this. And in fact, their whole very being is political desire is to prevent that from happening. So, is it in the British or Irish states to, as soon as it gets to 50.2% positive, to then impose a United Ireland on a pretty well-armed, devoted population who has shown about, 300 years of opposition to this kind of move? No. The Irish Republic won't do it. British government would be foolish to get involved in that sense. I don't see that. I don't see it as a possibility that is short-term thing. Do I think attitudes can change? Yes, in my lifetime, the border has been changed. First for the good, now it's edgy again. But you can take a train from Dublin to Belfast. You don't even know you're in Northern. I mean, there's no border. You just take a train from Dublin to Belfast. You just go from Dublin to Belfast. It's like going anywhere else. You get out the station. These things are changed. There aren't arms. There were used to have to do checkpoints and all that in the 90s when I first started going to Belfast. So things have changed. And I'd be foolish not to say that in 10, 15, 20, 25 years that there might evolve new structures. Britain might get political leadership that takes them back into the EU, which would then change the possibilities again. So, but I do think, and it's typed in Irish American newspapers we're talking about today. If you look at some of the newspapers, they think Irish unity is like right around the corner. I just don't. The players involved, I just don't see that happening. So I don't think I will live to see it, and I'm not planning on anything. But I do think it's more of a long-term possibility. I do. I think attitudes are changing. Just the simple fact when you go to Belfast, I get Airbnbs in East Belfast all the time because it's closer to the archive now in the Titanic lot. And I never would have done that 15 years ago. Probably should now in some ways. Some of my friends would tell me, is this Sean Michael Farrell? Thanks for the patience. If you have anything else, I'm happy to talk. If you have individual questions, I'm happy to sit here and talk a little bit. So I got to get back because I have to teach classes tomorrow. I got to drive back to Sycamore tonight. But I can have one IPA. One. Can I stop at one? That'll be. Anyway, thank you very much.